Alright, we're back reading the very last chapter of Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend by Domenico Lacerdo, translated by Salvatore Engel Demaro and Henry Hakamaki. We are on the very last part of this book, The Afterword. From Stalin to Gorbachev, How an Empire Ends. Luciano Canfora. Let's go. And then after this, on Thursdays here on the live stream, we'll be reading from the Man of Steel himself. A rule strictly adhered to by the historians of empire was that nothing should be said of the reigning prince or emperor while he was alive. This would be taken care of by the next historian, who would be silent in turn about the contemporary reigning prince. Justinian had, in this respect, a somewhat different but very symptomatic fate. It was in fact the same historian, Procopius of Caesarea, who put into circulation, while Justinian was still alive, numerous books of history that exalted his greatness, wisdom, victorious wars, etc., but who at the same time kept in store, destined for circulation after the death of the prince, a secret history in which Justinian is literally torn to pieces and appears as the receptacle of all wickedness, weakness, and useless cruelty, as well as vanity in attributing himself merits due to others. The secret history was written around 558 CE. Justinian died on 14th November 565 at the age of 83. When he died, the secret history demolished the victor of the Goths, the reconqueror of Italy, and restorer of the unity of the empire. Modern figures can freely isolate between the two extremes, as between the two portraits of Stalin, written by Nikita Khrushchev. On the one hand, the report of the 19th Congress of the CPSU, October 1952, in which all the credit for the economic, military, and social strength of the USSR is attributed to, quote, our beloved leader and master, Comrade Stalin. On the other, the secret speech, read in a closed session at the 20th CPSU Congress, February 1956, about 3 years after the death of Stalin. Here is in Procopius's secret history, the beloved master is presented as a ridiculous, cowardly, and bloodthirsty tyrant. So much so as to make it almost incomprehensible how he could have ruled for so long, and with the support of an infinite number of Khrushchevs. Tolstoy's vision, aimed at nullifying the greatness of the great personalities of history, is undoubtedly a good antidote to heroic historiography. It fails, however, to account for the intertwining of individual meanness and political efficacy that makes some personalities find themselves at the epicenter of epochal events and transformations, which posterity will continue to consider such despite all possible secret stories. Santo Mazzarino, one of Italy's greatest historians, used to liken Stalin to Justinian for being both great builders, great despots, and great intolerants. Between 565, the year of Justinian's death, and the brief and catastrophic reign of Phocas, 608 to 610, the great Justinian construction came undone. The reconquest of the West, and in particular of Italy, came to nothing. During his short reign, Phocas proved incapable of facing insurrections, external attacks, and the spread of a growing anarchy. Until Hercules, son of the governor of the province of Africa, conquered Constantinople in a coup d'etat in 610 and founded a new dynasty. The comparison, admittedly, only partly apt as are all historiographical comparisons, is between Justinian and Stalin on the one hand, and Phocas and Gorbachev on the other. Simplifications are not always beneficial, but can give an idea. In my opinion, it is not good that people often still refrain from talking about Stalin with a clear head, as is now done for Robespierre or other bloodthirsty proponents of revolution. One snaps instead of weighing the pros and cons. Moreover, if Time, in 1944, proclaimed Stalin Man of the Year, there must be a reason. If during the years of Nazi fascist danger, European anti-fascism paid him frank words of appreciation and recognition, there must be a reason. What some people stubbornly want, on the other hand, is to equate Stalin's work with the uniquely nefarious and destructive work of Hitler. After all, it is not by chance that Nazism led the world to war and catastrophe, and the USSR did not. In the end, it dissolved. It did not drag its adversaries and the world into the abyss. Stalin's policy was to keep out of the conflict, up to the point of blindness, and not heeding the warnings that were reaching him from many quarters in June 1941. In a few lines, I will not be able to summarize the results that many scholars have provided in the past decades about the management of power in the USSR. I will only say that the questions are two. A. Which models of people power, democracy to be precise, have emerged from the 1917 revolution? B. What actual practices were instead established in the USSR and in satellite countries? I think it is legitimate to speak on the first point. It is enough to think of the studies of the codifications of constitutional law in the USSR. It is at the same time necessary to compare these texts and those efforts with the hard lessons of reality and with actual practice. I wrote in my book on democracy that in the last period of Stalin's rule, the premises were laid for the ruin of the system. In fact, what is in, sorry. In fact, that is what it had been. Since the break with Trotsky and the outlawing of the opposition within the Communist Party, an uninterrupted civil war that had been waged with ferocity and with no holds barred, should have been exhausted or lessened after the victory of 1945. To have perpetrated its instruments was ruinous. On this concept of civil war, referring to the entire period from 1927 to the eve of World War II, I like to remember the pages of Furtwängler, Moscow, 1937, the Jewish writer exiled to the US, where he lived until his death. What has been said so far has only one presupposition, that we discuss history. But in order to discuss history, one must know the meaning of words. It amuses me a little to observe what misunderstandings have arisen from the expression I used about creating a myth around the partition of Poland. Someone thought I was saying that Poland had not been partitioned. In Italian, on the contrary, that phrase means that an undisputable fact is being mythologized. That is, it occupies the whole scene. It becomes the fact par excellence. This was one of the aspects of the Pact of August 1939. The other aspects were the desire to destroy sooner or later the USSR that was well rooted in Hitler's mind, as Kershaw has documented in his fine books, as well as the Anglo-French unwillingness to really come to an anti-German pact together with Stalin. Churchill writes well about this in his The Gathering Storm. Not to mention Polish hostility to allowing Soviet troops to pass through its territory in the event of a conflict with Germany. And not to mention Polish participation during the preceding year in the partition of Czechoslovakia. And let us point to an example on another front. Bach documented in his book, Der Glante Död, or The Planned Death, the annihilation by the USA of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners. Those were iron-hard times, as Tibullus would have said. To lecture from a pulpit, to give votes and democratic credentials now for past events makes one smile a little. It is a good rule to understand ourselves through the words of those who would look at us with a critical eye, not through the sterile consensus of the consenting and their followers. The most pertinent portrait of Julius Caesar, dead and no longer fearsome, was outlined by Cercio, who certainly had never loved him. In a well-chiseled passage of the second Philippic, which wisely balances the merits and limits of the dictator whom he himself had praised in life. In the case of Stalin, it can be said without fear of being mistaken that both when he was alive and when he was dead, laudatory and demonizing literature were not in short supply. For figures who, in a given historical moment, have summoned up in their own person the very meaning and symbol of the movement they led. The cult, quote unquote, of their person is a phenomenon not only well attested, but it seems difficult to avoid. Many names could be mentioned, but the most familiar and obvious are certainly Caesar and Napoleon. The need on the part of the followers to mythologize the leader, to whom corresponds the intuition on the part of the leader of the indispensable function of such mythologizing mechanism, is a well-documented phenomenon. it stands out all the more and reveals itself to be a mechanism that goes beyond the choice of the individual, when the person concerned would be, due to their style and culture, alien to such a quasi-religious relationship, and yet, when it occurs, adapts to it. This is the case of the incorruptible, who is the exact opposite of the demagogue thirsting for the cheering crowd, or even, in times closer to us, of Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci recounts, amused in a letter from prison, of the disappointment felt by a comrade, met during one of his stays in prison, who had imagined the leader of the communists to have a very different, imposing stature. In this category, however unusual it may be to say it, one can also include Stalin, who, for not an insignificant stretch of his long career, wanted to keep himself in the role of the ideal second, of a mere faithful executor of the work designed by another, one much greater, and who even in death should have continued to be perceived as the leader. That is, Lenin. And so, Stalin dedicated to him a mausoleum, a pharaonic, Hellenistic, Byzantine type, because on him, the only living leader, although dead, and therefore embalmed, the need for charisma of the Soviet masses would continue to converge. By the same dynamic, Augustus presented himself for a long time as Caesar's heir executor, continuator, vindicator, and devoted a cult to him, making him one with the gods. It is therefore more necessary than ever, when faced with historical figures whose myth was an essential part of their actions, and of their being perceived by others, to refer to the judgment, limiting but unclouded, of non followers, of thinking and distant people, and also of adversaries. And the Sida Libera of August 23rd, 1945, Horst, who had never conceded anything to his communist counterparts, not even in the moments of the CLNist unity, who in 1932, in Storia de Europa, had written, quote, "Communism has not been implemented in Russia as communism," wrote about Stalin words that could even seem to be praising, but were not. Quote, "What has been implemented in Russia," he wrote, "is the government of a class, or of a group of classes, bureaucrats, military intellectuals, in which no longer hereditary emperors, but men of gifted political genius, Lenin and Stalin led." Unquote. And he added with prophetic irony, quote, "Providence remains responsible for always providing comparable successors." Unquote. Alcide de Gasperi had spoken of genius, and this time not in a neutral sense, as in the words of Croce, but in an exalting one, relating to Stalin. A few months earlier, at the Brancaccio Theater in Rome, at the very moment in which he firmly outlined the unbridgeable distance of the Soviet experiment from the form, still to be specified, of post-fascist Italy, he had nevertheless spoken of the immense historical, enduring merit of the armies organized by the genius of Joseph Stalin. It was easy at the time to promise enduring gratitude to the victors of Stalingrad. Paolo Bufalini recalled a priest who, while embracing him in hiding, had whispered to him, "We will win at Stalingrad." But as Herodotus well knew, the victory of the Athenians at Salamis against a preponderant and apparently invincible adversary had been gradually forgotten, even though it was the harbinger of the freedom of the Greeks. Forgotten by the beneficiaries themselves, because that victory had given rise to the Athenian Empire, oppressive heir to an initially equal alliance. And here's a note on that CLNist term. The CLNist is a term used to describe the period in, in Italy. Yeah, CLNS is a term used to describe the period in Italy following the end of World War II and the victory of the resistance against fascism, during which various committees of liberation, CLN, were active, primarily made up of members of the Communist Party of Italy, PCI, the Italian Socialist Party, PSI, and the Action Party, PA. History repeated itself. And after the Battle of Marinego in Italy, the features of the liberator gradually became uglier. The Battle of Marinego is the 14th of June, 1800, a battle during the Second Italian Campaign where the Habsburg armies were defeated, turning the tide in favor of the French government in the years preceding the Napoleonic Wars. In short, it is too easy to speak en gros of imperial aims and trampled freedoms. In post 1945 Eastern Europe, it is worth reading Ambler's remarkable story, Judgment on Delchev, which does not satisfy itself with simplistic declarations about the gallows of Prague. And it is better to read Wilfrid Loth's essay, Stalin's Unwanted Child, the Soviet Union, the German Question, and the Founding of the GDR, on Stalin's reluctance to allow the establishment of a republic in the Soviet zone of Germany, rather than the insulating rhetoric on the Iron Curtain. Stalin is returning to the collective consciousness of the Russians, as many polls indicate, because in the current discomfort of the decline of the former superpower, it is obvious, just out of common sense, the recognition of a statesman who made it great by uplifting it from the state of material inferiority and isolation. Molotov remembers that Stalin had once said to him, "After my death, they will throw garbage on my grave, but long afterwards they will understand." The quasi-judicial indictment that hangs over Stalin is that of a disproportionate mowing down of human lives. To quote one thinker I'm familiar with, double tapping and burying them in the woods. This yardstick of evaluation, which already throughout the 19th century accompanied and distorted the comings and goings, very similar to the present of historiography on the French Revolution, has recently been polluted by the monstrosity of the so-called Black Book of Communism. By Curtius and companions, a book that includes, among the victims of Stalin, even the millions of deaths of the Second World War, or among the victims of communism, the untold victims of the UNITA in Angola. After that monstrous pamphlet, it is difficult to bring the discussion back to a decent level. Nor is the rapid dismantling of those staggering figures sufficient. It is the connection between revolution and terror that is the hard problem. It began with Robespierre, not with Lenin, and it is still open. But he sent legions of communists to their death, is the other judicial charge. Wadjes Danton, after all, meant precisely this, and denounced it. The great Jewish writer Leon Feuchtwanger, who gave Stalin the merit of having been the first to give a state to the Jews in Birodinsa within USSR, remarked, with regard to the great trials, a crucial factor. Quote, most of the accused were first and foremost conspirators and revolutionaries. All their lives they had been subversives and opponents. They were born for this. Unquote. It was the same observation that de Gasperi was to make years later, in the already mentioned speech at the Braccio. Quote, we believe that the trials were false, the testimonies invented, the confessions extorted. Now, objective American information assures us that it was not a matter of a fake, and that the saboteurs were not vulgar swindlers. They were old, idealistic conspirators who faced death rather than adapt themselves to what, for them, was a betrayal of original communism. Unquote. After the 20th Congress, Concerto Marci sarcastically remarked Tiberius had Tacitus as his judge. Stalin, who was less fortunate, got Khrushchev. It was a joke. With the 20th Congress, in reality, a power struggle was opening within the leadership. Not unlike the one that had pitted Trotsky and Stalin against each other. It was a no-holds-barred struggle, of which de-Stalinization was one element. It was not an attempt at historiography. If anything, it was the most scandalous negation of historiography. And even those who liked Togliatti understood its instrumentality and substantial falsity, could not unmask its nature and radical genesis. Because Togliatti and himself and the other leaders of the communist movement were, willing or unwilling, part of this new struggle. The initial outcomes of which were the revolutions within the Soviet camp, and the long-term ones are the very history we have just lived through. Curzio Malaparte, in an important and forgotten book, Coup d'etat, The Technique of Revolution, published in France in 1931, destined to displease both the communists and their adversaries, recorded the chronicle of an event that explains better than any reasoning the permanent conflict and uninterrupted repression that characterized the years of Stalin's rule up to the war. That was the coup d'etat attempted by Trotsky in Moscow on November 7, 1927, during the parade for the 10th anniversary of the revolution. It was a failed coup, which was followed by a very deep division in the party, where Trotsky's prestige remained enormous, and a creeping civil war, which Soviet propaganda reductively presented as judicial activity against saboteurs. This was an event within which to situate and understand the Stalin phenomenon. The formation of the USSR, industrialization, the war against the kulaks, mass literacy, the creation of a free welfare state, the attempt to stay out of the war imposed by Hitler, the victory over Nazism achieved through unimaginable efforts without a real consensus. These are the events with which the historian must deal. Without ever forgetting that, behind the scenes, a civil conflict was taking place. A split within the hegemonic party that had never subsided. The Puritans of ideology never liked Stalin. Coletti appropriately defined him 20 years after his death in L'Aspero as one who never let himself be caught in the snares of ideology. But so much realism was not an end in itself. The unsigned editorial with which the Corriere de Sera commented on Stalin's death on the 6th of March 1953 still stands the test of time after 50 years of historiographical battles and fashions. The article reads, quote, "This work cost untold sacrifices and was conducted with a rigor that knew no mercy. Freedom, respect for the person, tolerance, charity were vain words and were treated as dead things. It was only during the Second World War that we saw how deeply those labors had worked. It is yesterday's history. But when the hour of the supreme test sounded, the man showed himself equal to himself and to the great tasks that he sought, and that history had assigned to him." Unquote. The question of whether Stalin saw himself and his political action as inherent in the rebirth of his country after the catastrophe, war, upheaval, revolution, civil war, or rather in the history of the world communist movement, can be debated at length. To put it more briefly, the issue is whether he felt that he was first and foremost a Russian statesman or a communist leader with global responsibilities. It is characteristic of the historiographical reflection of Trotsky's inspiration, Trotsky himself, Juche, to give credence to the first answer. It was, on the other hand, characteristic of the official party historiography, even after 1956, to reframe such an answer as reductive, distorting, which moreover found acceptance even outside the political historical discussions within the communist movement. And to put before the figure of Stalin, the statesman, anyway, for better or worse, the figure and role of Stalin as a party man. Today, more than 50 years after the disappearance of Stalin, the reasons for party historiography become more insignificant in our eyes. While on the contrary, the historical problem of the place of Stalin and his successors in the history of Russia in our century stands out. A similar reflection should be made about grafting communism onto the history of China by a heretic like Mao. Isaac Juche has devoted his entire book to demonstrate that Stalinism would, at a certain point, jump out from the skin of Russia, like the scab of a wound, once the deformity had been overcome. Socialism and restored democratic praxis would be reunited with a more coherent internationalism. Never has a prediction proved more unfounded. There are three principal moments in the USSR's international relations policy, which constitute its common thread, and which mutually illuminate each other. Brest-Litovsk, January 1918, the Russian-German Pact, August 1939, and Yalta, February 1945. The beginning is Brest-Litovsk. The clash within the Bolshevik leadership between supporters and opponents of the peace noose is well known. In order not to subscribe to it, Trotsky resigned from the foreign commissariat. Zionev and Kamenev had great misgivings, fully in agreement with Lenin, who supported the necessity of peace in any case. Stalin, on the other hand, supported the treaty. In party hagiography, this then became a strong point and a title of merit of the Stalinists in their frenzied work of discrediting the other Bolshevik factions. In the infamous History of the Communist Party of the USSR, one reads these formulations, in which well-founded considerations and phrases of repugnant mystification are intermixed. To continue the war under such conditions would have meant staking the very existence of the newborn Soviet Republic. The working class and the peasantry were confronted with the necessity of accepting onerous terms of peace, of retreating before the most dangerous marauder of the time, German imperialism. All the counter-revolutionaries, from the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries to the most errant White Guards, conducted a frenzied campaign against the signing of the peace treaty. Their policy was clear. They wanted to wreck the peace negotiations, provoke a German offensive, and thus imperil the still weak Soviet power and endanger the gains of the workers and peasants. Their allies in this sinister scheme were Trotsky and his minion Bukharin. The latter, together with Radek and Pyatakov, heading a group which was hostile to the party but camouflaged itself under the name of left communists. Trotsky and the group of left communists began a fierce struggle within the party against Lenin, demanding the continuation of the war. These people were clearly playing into the hands of the German imperialists. On February 10th, 1918, the peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk were broken off. Although Lenin and Stalin, in the name of the Central Committee of the party, had insisted that peace be signed, Trotsky, who was chairman of the Soviet delegation at the Brest-Litovsk treachery, violated the direct instructions of the Bolshevik Party. He announced that the Soviet Republic refused to reach peace on the terms proposed by Germany. At the same time, he informed the Germans that the Soviet Republic would not fight and would continue to demobilize the army. The narrative is at times grotesque, and there is an abundance of slanderous insinuations against Trotsky. It is later claimed that Trotsky and Bukharin were preparing a coup d'etat in order to sabotage peace. The strong point of the story, however, remains the fact that, in the clash over the problem of peace, Lenin and Stalin, sometimes in the minority, were on the side in favor of an exit from the war as soon as possible, while a large part of the other leaders, in primus with Trotsky, who went so far as to resign in order not to sign, were on the opposite front. The clash was very bitter, as is obvious. It is no accident that not only the history of the Communist Party, but also Trotsky's Mein Leben devoted whole sections, Trotsky almost 30 pages, to the affair. It should be observed that despite the fact that Trotsky's account is far superior to the irritating prose of the history of the Communist Party, it is patently apologetic and at times obscure, full of details aimed at attenuating the fact that Trotsky and Lenin were on opposite sides, and always reciting about the position assumed by Stalin in the crucial affair. The choice made in Brest-Litovsk is also the birth of the Soviet foreign policy. It was a foreign policy of a state which has its own interests at heart first and foremost. It is understood on the basis of the corollary, The strengthening of the USSR benefits the cause of revolution and the whole planet. Trotsky cultivated the illusion of replicating the Battle of Valmy, of giving fuel to spread the revolutionary fire, as at the time of Dumouriez, and the victorious conflict of revolutionary France against the coalitions. Lenin and Stalin, who differed in so many ways but agreed on this, realistically gauged the balance of forces and maintained the course of action that would re-emerge in 1939, before the renewed danger of war. Quote, "The imperialists are massacring each other. We stay out of it and strengthen ourselves." Unquote. Juche once wrote, "In one fundamental respect, Stalin did, of course, continue Lenin's work. He strove to preserve the state founded by Lenin and to increase its might. Then if Lenin had survived, he would have ended up carrying out Stalin's policies, as Juche observes. In fact, only one road was open to the state, the one leading towards autocracy. The Bolshevik regime could not revert to its democratic origin because it could not hope for enough democratic support to guarantee its survival. This was the lodestar of Stalin's foreign policy. If some illusions of vast fronts and possible alliances were still being cultivated by some, foreign interventions in the Civil War, the cordon sanitaire, and the lengthy exclusions from the international bodies were enough to make clear the effective relationship with the outside world. Hence the dominant feature of Soviet foreign policy, from the beginning, to negotiate with anyone. The agenda put to a vote by Lenin on 22nd of February 1918 at a meeting of the Central Committee in a phase soon to be revealed as transitory of the Brest-Litovsk negotiations, Comrade Trotsky is given full powers to accept the help of the French imperialist brigands against the German brigands. Thus, in the aftermath of the peace news, it happened that Lordanov's Germany was the only country with which Bolshevik Russia managed to have relations, at least for a few months. And the rather calm and understanding tone with which the bulletin of the German High Command spoke of Russia and Lenin fits perfectly into the apparently unnatural collaboration. Collaboration resumed with the center-right Weimar government, beginning with the Treaty of Rapallo in the 16th of April, 1922. Precisely from this point of view, according to which there was no illusion of being able to see any difference between French brigades and German brigands, and the possibility of greater collaboration with the Germans arose from the fact that they too were victims of the order imposed by Versailles against the winners, that is, by the great and democratic Western imperialist powers. The failure of the revolutionary wave of 1919-1920, the occupation of the factories in Italy, Bavarian Republic of the Councils, Bela Kun's Hungary, the military defeat in the conflict with Poland, definitely confirmed to the Soviet leadership the rightness of its foreign policy choices. From similar assumptions follows the choice of the Pact of 1939. One almost always neglects to consider, when judging that major event on the threshold of the Second World War, that it occurred the day after the failure of Stalin's only real attempt at internationalist foreign policy and broad democratic alliances. That is, after the collapse of the Spanish Republic, helped militarily only by the Soviets and the international brigades, abandoned by the governments of France, that is, by the socialist Léon Bonne and England. The fall of Madrid, 28th of March 1939, preceded by a few months of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which came about, as is well known, as a result of Anglo-French disinterest in the effectiveness of anti-German, anti-Nazi agreement with the USSR. The choice of reaching an agreement with Germany to stay out of the war while the brigades destroyed each other was but a continuation of the situation favorable to the German interloper, in exchange for the great benefit of assuring peace on the Eastern Front. The reasons given afterwards, according to which the pact had been made to prepare better to win time with respect to a later German attack, are probably reasons constructed post eventum. It is not at all clear that Stalin really believed the German attack against the USSR was inevitable. And indeed, the state of unpreparedness in which Operation Barbarossa found the Soviet lines would lead one to think the contrary. It is not superfluous to bring to bear, finally, an analogy between the situation of 1918 and that of 1939. It was highlighted by Mikhail Gorbachev in his report of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the 7th of November 1987 on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the revolution. Quote, "The question," Gorbachev said at the time, "was posed in more or less the same terms in which it had been posed at the time of the peace at Brest. The fate of the independence of our country and the very existence of socialism on earth were being decided." Unquote. And he added, quote, "From the documents, it is known that the date of the German aggression against Poland, no later than September 1st, was already fixed on April 3rd, 1939. That is, long before the conclusion of the pact between USSR and Germany. London, Paris, Washington knew the background preparations of the campaign against Poland down to the tiniest details." And again, nor can we forget that in August 1939, the USSR was faced with the threat of war on two fronts, to the west with Germany and to the east with Japan, which had unleashed a bloody conflict on the Kaliningal River. As at the time of Brest-Litovsk, so concluded Gorbachev, quote, "life and death, sweeping away myths, became the only criterion of reality." As at the time of Brest-Litovsk, so concluded Gorbachev. Quote, "life and death, sweeping away myths, became the only criterion of reality." Dragged into an unwanted war, Stalin took his country to victory. Through the hardest trials, reminiscent in many ways of those faced by Alexander I and Khrushchev against the French aggression of 1812. And he won by uniting the country around the slogan of the Great Patriotic War, recovering, among other things, a positive relationship with the Orthodox Church. American military aid had its importance. Averell Harriman has sometimes recalled the phrase detailed by Stalin, according to whom, quote, "without American industrial power, the war could not have been won." Unquote. To tell the truth, however, it must be said that, if that aid was precious, The exasperating delay of the opening of the Second Front meant that, up to the Normandy landings, 6th and 7th of June 1944, the whole burden of the war in Europe was borne by the Soviets. In this sense, it is correct to say that Hitler lost the war at Stalingrad. The landing in Sicily did not constitute a second front, or it did so only marginally. The Allied landing in the spring of 1943 in the extreme south of Italy was such as to allow the Germans to keep the Anglo-Americans in check with the minimum of forces and for a very long time, as they were laboriously forced to move up the entire peninsula. It is symptomatic that, as is clear from the correspondence between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin from February to May 1944, as the prospect of the Anglo-American launching of Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings, consolidated, the subject of the future order of Poland returned insistently in the correspondence between the three statesmen. Already in the exchange of letters of the 4th and 24th of February, Stalin had made it clear to Churchill that the so-called Polish government in exile in London would have to accept the Curzon Line as the future Polish-Soviet delineation. Despite the reluctance of the unrepresentative Polish government in exile, which caused the Moscow talks to fail precisely due to the border issue, Churchill accepted the de facto situation. And it is well known that the partition of Yalta, preceded in October 1944 by the famous leaflet with the percentages of the zones of influence, meant even if this was not officially sanctioned in the Crimea, that in the Polish question, as also in other areas, the territorial advantages that the USSR had gained with the Pact of August 1939 were substantially confirmed. There was, in short, full agreement between the action pursued by Stalin in the immediate post-war period and the substance of the territorial agreements included in the Russian-German Pact. This is why, as already noted, a single thread links the three pivotal moments of Soviet diplomacy: Brest-Litovsk, the non-aggression pact with Germany, and Yalta. Three moments in which even the most bitter adversaries, indeed especially them, recognized Stalin's ability to intuit, as a statesman of rank, the interest of his country and his consistency in pursuing, over such a vast span of time, that interest. Not an imperial or expansionist policy, but a security policy, accepted as such also by the Western counterparts. It is enough to think of the Yalta decisions, not codified but accepted and kept firm even in the moments of greatest tension: the Berlin blockade, the Hungarian Revolution. It was a security policy that had its formal definition in the new borders. It is interesting in this regard to note that on the occasion of the reprinting of the 1941-45 war correspondence of the leaders of the anti-Nazi coalition, an introduction by Gromyko begins the volume essentially with a hymn to the deliberations confirmed in Helsinki on the 1st of August 1975, writing that, quote, "Today, the inviolability of the borders of Europe has been recognized by all European states, as well as the US and Canada, who have signed in Helsinki on the August 1st the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation on Europe. This agreement is of historical significance and is a great contribution to the cause of peace." Gromyko, who was a member of the Soviet delegation at Yalta, grasps with these words the meaning, recognized moreover by all the parties, agreed of the CSCE, the formal recognition, that is, the frontiers that emerged from the Second World War. It was the formal coronation of a policy inaugurated with the great act of realism that consistent in accepting, way back in February 1918, the regulatory clause of the Peace of Brest. This is why, at the moment of the rapid, tumultuous Gorbachevian dismantling of the USSR, the Western powers remained, at first, perplexed. They hesitated to extend their protection to initiatives such as that, for example, of Ladisbergs and his followers in Lithuania, aimed at questioning what they had sanctioned and reaffirmed in Yalta and Helsinki over a period of 30 years. That is why Gorbachev's foreign policy, which consisted in spontaneously dismantling the strong points of the state, of which he was leader, awaits, and perhaps will continue to wait for a long time, its historian, and before that, its interpreter. At times, one has the impression of having in front of one's eyes two different personalities, struggling against each other, enclosed in the same person. The leader who still, in November 1987, vindicated the rightness of the choices of the August 1939 Pact, is the same person who wrote in La Stampa on the 3rd of March 1992, quote, "Today, we can say that everything that has happened in Eastern Europe in these last few years would not have been possible without the presence of this Pope, without the great role, including in a political sense, that he has been able to play." Unquote. These are the words that Carl Bernstein, protagonist at the time of Watergate and author in February 1992 of the inquiry into the secret pact between Reagan and Wojtyla, Pope John Paul II, for massive support for Solidarność and the undermining by those means of the Polish communist regime, defined in April 1992 in his first correspondence for Le Sabado, the unveiling of one of the greatest secrets of the 20th century. Gorbachev's collaborative journalism at La Stampa deserves a systematic analysis. Since between the turns and saccharine words of the generic chit-chat that Gorbachev delivered to that important newspaper emerge every now and then formulations that should shed some light on the elusive personality of the last General Secretary of the CPSU. An example is the one that appears towards the end of the long essay of 26th of November 1992. Yeltsin, Carrot and Stick. Quote, "After having rightly thrown away the communist model because of its uselessness, we should avoid falling into other rigid models." Unquote. Moreover, the revelation to which Carl Bernstein has drawn attention, that is, Gorbachev's appreciation for the role played by Wojtyla in the demolition of the communist regimes, does not sit well with the concluding lines of the dialogue between Gorbachev and Wojtyla on the 1st of December 1989. The text itself was published by Gorbachev himself in his Avant Memories, where Wojtyla says, quote, "No one should pretend that the changes in Europe and in the world must take place according to the Western model. That is contrary to my deepest convictions. Europe, as protagonist of world history, must breathe with both its lungs." Unquote. And Gorbachev replies, "It is a very pertinent image." In light of what Gorbachev revealed, quote unquote, in March 1992, this proclamation is very puzzling. It is all the more so if one takes into account the thinking of the brutal exec of Wojtyla's thought. That is, Polish President Walesia, oh god, interviewed by Jaskowronski for La Stampa, May 9th, 1993. Wallachia was faced with a following question. Quote, who brought about the collapse of communism? Would you agree with a classification like this? John Paul II, Wallachia, Gorbachev, Reagan? And he answered, not without skill. Quote, certainly the role of the Pope was very important. I would say decisive. The others are all links in the chain of freedom. It is difficult to say which was more important, but any chain without a link is no longer a chain. Many, especially the Germans, believe that Gorbachev is the most important, but I don't agree. Unquote. And later in the interview, he also makes a revelation that he had proposed to Gorbachev in 1989 to take the initiative to dissolve the USSR. On February 24th, 1992, after Time had published Carl Bernstein's investigation on the secret pact between Reagan and Wojtyla for the overthrow of communist regime in Poland, with details concerning, for example, the radio link set up between Vatican palaces and Cardinal Glemp after the Warsaw government had cut off telephone communications between Poland and the Vatican, or relating to the enlistment of the CIA of the Polish Vice Minister of Defense, or to the flow of money sent to Poland to support the clandestine trade union. There was embarrassment in Vatican circles. A euphoric Reagan, in contrast, confirmed when interviewed by Pino Bronghirini for Panorama, quote, our intention, Reagan refers to his administration and that of Wojtyla's author's note, had been from the beginning to unite to defeat the forces of communism, unquote. And then he continued with multiple revelations and details, published by the Italian Weekly in the issue of March 22nd, 1992. But it is likely that the massive intervention, not novel, even if enhanced by the Polish origin of the incumbent pontiff, would not have been enough. At least in the opinion of a sharp analyst of all things Soviet, such as Helmut Sonnenfeld. Quote, when the Polish door opened, Sonnenfeld told Panorama, Moscow did not move a finger. Who knows whether Gorbachev's behavior had not been influenced by the Vatican intervention, unquote. A hypothesis that seemed to be confirmed by the very compromising words written by Gorbachev for La Stampa on March 3rd, 1992. So it is not surprising that shortly afterwards, in the same conversation, Sonnenfeld speaks, without naming names, of, quote, those who, in some room of the Kremlin, decided to let everyone go free, unquote. The political actions taken by Gorbachev, starting at least in 1988, primarily affected his compatriots. The condition of Russia was described as follows by Francois Mitterrand in conversation with the then president of the Italian Senate, Spettolini. Quote, before the people ate little, but everyone ate equally little. Now in Russia, there are many mafias. The president, Spettolini noted, uses the Italian term with deliberate emphasis, that confront and fight each other, and that ensure sectors of privilege, monstrously distant from the generalized starvation and poverty. An explosive situation, to say the least, unquote. Not bad for the fruits of transition to freedom. Of what kind we then saw with the shelling of the parliament in October 1993. No wonder then that Gorbachev is one of the most detested people in his country, and less pampered by his friends abroad. Quote, one can expect anything from a scholar of history, except that of believing in the naivete that led Gorbachev to make the mistake after mistake, capitulation after capitulation. Marcus Wolf, the great artificer of the GDR's security services, recalled during an interview with the Daily La Republica that all three of the architects of the collapse of the USSR, Gorbachev, Dzhirkovanidze, and Yeltsin, had worked for the KGB. Putin too. Unquote. To the Athenians, tired of the conflict with Sparta, Hercules, speaking to the assembly, taught a great geopolitical truth. It is not possible for you to give up this empire. And with the conceptual rawness from which he was not alien, he added that the empire is tyranny. That it may seem unfair to defend it, but it is certainly highly risky to lose it. In the end, the empire, which lasted little more than 70 years, was lost thanks to those strategists. One was called Artamantis, who was in decisive battle of Egipotami. Betrayed, as they said at the time, the fleet. By a curious historical combination, the Soviet Empire also lasted 70 years. The juxtaposition of Stalin and Hercules may give rise to some uneasiness. Even though non-bigoted scholars such as Mikhail Heller and Sergio Romani insisted on the greatness of the Georgian statesman, it is perhaps easier, even in the recklessness of analogies, to recognize in Gorbachev the mediocre and virulent role of Artamantis. That brings us to the end. We are all finished. Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend by Domenico and Lucerdo. Domenico Lucerdo. Not Domenico and Lucerdo, by Domenico Lucerdo. Next, starting on Thursdays, we're going to be reading from The Man of Steel himself, from Stalin. If you enjoyed this read, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button on my channel if you want to hear more reads like this. And if you want to read along for yourself or have a copy for yourself, remember that these PDFs are absolutely free on iskrabooks.org. And there is all kinds of fantastic books that I highly recommend on the site, of course. All of them available as free PDFs. So, starting next, we're going to continue with something that we've read a little bit of, but we're going to continue on with this book next. Stalin, Collected Works, Volume 1.